Welcome to the Russell Moore Show. This is the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter, which you can sign up to get for free in your inbox every Wednesday with the link in the show notes. Today, I want to talk about what the death of Jimmy Carter reveals about American Christianity right now in 2025. Ever since the dawn of the modern media era, the television era, every American president's funeral has been broadcast live. Since the dawn of the social media era, all those aspects of a presidential postmortem, the announcement of death, the lying in state, the funeral procession, the eulogies, they're video clipped and discussed across multiple platforms. Until the death of Jimmy Carter, though, we've not been accustomed to seeing a live stream of the judgment seat when the deceased stands to give an account of his life and to hear the pronouncement of eternal destiny. The judgment seat this time, though, was not of Jesus Christ. Our technology is still not that good, but of the guardians of a politicized American Christianity. What I mean by this is not that some American Christians demonstrated the kind of mean-spirited glee in denouncing the death of someone they deemed an enemy, that, at least for those of us who grew up in the funeral culture of the Bible Belt South, we were taught that that was at best impolite and at worst impious. But surely we're accustomed to seeing that by now. Those standards are long gone. What's new, though, is the way that some American Christians now take to social media to imply that Carter, who professed faith in Jesus Christ publicly and privately for the full lifetime of almost every person alive today, might be in hell. Now, those outside the subculture of evangelical Christianity might not be aware that on some matters, evangelicals have developed unwritten rules of Jesuitical complexity to enable us to disobey certain clear directives of Jesus without having to admit to doing so. The elderly women in my home church, including my grandmother, would never approve of bragging about themselves, but it was all right if you just add the words, "if I do say so myself," right before or after the boast. Similarly, it might be hard to see how a Christian could question the eternal destiny of another professing Christian, given Jesus' command not to judge one another. All one need to do, though, is to add some caveats, such as, well, no one knows the heart, and God is the judge, and we can only hope, with an implied shake of the head and shrug of the shoulders. Then one is allowed without penalty to say whatever one wants to about one's just dead enemy. In fact, that even includes what secularists can say more directly, but never as literally, go to hell. What should interest us in all of this is not that religious people can be judgmental. The empty tomb was still warm when the earliest disciples started arguing about who was in and who was out. Instead, what we should note is not the judgment, but the criteria by which it is made. That's what's revelatory about the state of American evangelical Christianity, an evangelical Christianity of which Jimmy Carter was once, in the minds of the American public, the grinning face. When revealing himself to his followers, the fundamental question Jesus asked was, "Who do you say that I am?" In Matthew 16:13. This had to do, first of all, with who Jesus is, and then with what he has done. The Apostle Paul wrote in words that every American evangelical young person of previous eras would have memorized. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10:9. With the assurance that comes with that, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Romans 10:13. Now, there's a category in the New Testament for someone who claims the name of Christ but has not really believed in him. There's a category for what 20th century theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously called cheap grace. Almost no one charges Carter with rejecting the affirmations of the person and work of Christ, found in the New Testament, reiterated in the historic creeds. He believed in the deity and humanity of Jesus, his atoning work on the cross, his bodily resurrection from the dead. Almost no one questions Carter's own sense of what the gospel was, that he saw himself as a sinner who could not justify himself in the eyes of God, who trusted in the blood and righteousness of Jesus for eternal life. Carter himself made that clear publicly. Just a few years ago, he and I talked privately about all those commitments extensively, and about sharing the gospel with those who haven't heard it. That's not really in question. None of that is. So the implication that Jimmy Carter might not have been a real Christian is an indication of a kind of works righteousness that is opposed to the insistence of the New Testament apostles that the gospel is one of grace, one that cannot be earned, but can only be received by simple, trusting faith. As much as we should reject that kind of false gospel, and we should, at least it would be understandable if that's all there was to it. After all, the gospel of grace was so startling to religious people that the Apostle Paul had to clarify repeatedly that it did not mean sin all you want because Jesus. Works righteousness seems plausible enough that it could, in the words of Paul, bewitch the faith of entire churches in the first century. See the book of Galatians from start to finish. And that's because God does, in fact, call us to obedience and to holiness. A faith that does not work itself out in love is, as James writes, dead. Virtually no one questions the personal character of Carter, faithful to his wife Rosalind to the point of asking in hospice to be home so that he could hold hands with her in bed. He can't even be charged with self-righteousness over his sexual morality, given his infamous Lust in My Heart interview, which almost derailed his 1976 presidential campaign, pointing out that he could not judge others because given Jesus' Sermon on the Mount standards, Carter's own internal heart wandering meant that he was an adulterer too. And that meant that he was too in need of God's grace. The expressed doubts over whether Carter was a real Christian, these have to do instead with a different standard, that of belonging to the right political tribe, holding the right political and social opinions. And therein is the tragedy of 21st century American Christianity. On many of those political tribal points, I too would differ with Carter, and I too would see many of them as of great importance. For over 30 years, I've worked in the pro-life movement in opposition to abortion. Carter said that he personally opposed abortion and thought it should not be government funded, but he did not think that the state should outlaw it. I think he was gravely wrong on that. Carter believed that Jesus' principles of non-retaliation and opposition to the taking of life meant that capital punishment is always immoral. I disagree. I support the death penalty in many cases. Before the abortion debate became what it later became in the mid to late 1970s, largely due to the advocacy and public education work of mostly Roman Catholic pro-life thinkers and activists, not a few very conservative evangelical Christians, such as Southern Baptist conservative patriarch W.A. Criswell, Christianity Today's founding editor-in-chief, Carl F. H. Henry, etc., were in the same camp as Carter, personally disapproving of abortion, but believing it should be legal in some cases. I'm glad they changed their minds. Question is, though, after they changed their minds, should they have sought baptism? In other words, were they non-Christians when they had the wrong view? Would they have gone to heaven if they had died 5 minutes before they came to the right view? This is especially pronounced when, as many have noted, virtually no one who questions Carter's personal salvation, given his wrong positions on social justice issues for unborn children, much less other, much less important social and political questions, none of them question the personal salvation of 18th and 19th century professing Christians who opposed the abolition of a system that kidnapped, bought, sold as chattel property, separated families, exploited the labor, and systematically raped human beings made in the image of God. And most of those who would question whether Carter was really saved defend not just as Christians, but as Christian teachers and leaders, those who deny historic, creedally defined doctrinal non-negotiables on matters as important as the doctrine of God and the Trinity, so long as they are in bounds on what really matters, the support of the right politicians and the opposition to the wrong ones. That's what the old fundamentalists would have called modernism. That kind of Christianity is easier than both the true gospel of grace and the false gospel of works. To hold to a true works righteousness, after all, one would have to at least pretend to obey the moral demands of God, both in the pursuit of public justice and in fidelity to personal virtues. We all fall short, though, of the glory of God. So to pretend to be justified by such things requires some deception of others. It's what Paul talks about in Romans 2, or of oneself, what John talks about in 1 John 1. American Christianity has found a much easier form of works righteousness, though, one that doesn't require, well, work. One can be in a horrible marriage, filled with envy or rage or pride, piling up wealth for oneself while disregarding neighbor, but be justified as a real Christian by pontificating all the right political and social positions. That doesn't cost a thing. In fact, if you do it right, it can even make you rich. Justification by ideology alone is easier than faith. To follow Jesus, after all, means declaring personal moral bankruptcy. It means giving up hope and being good enough or right enough to be the right kind of person for heaven. It means realizing that external conformity, whether of hard things like building houses for the poor or eradicating guinea worm, or easy things like expounding a Christian worldview in which, surprisingly enough, the principles and priorities are exactly the same as those of your political party. None of that can ever be enough. You must be born again. For years, a certain kind of politicized evangelicals used Jimmy Carter as an example of why personal character and piety is not enough for public leadership. The qualifications to be president are different than the qualifications to be Sunday school teacher. Many people would say, fair enough, that's true. But what if all along what some really meant is that the qualifications for Sunday school teacher are the same as those of a politician? The sort of world that defines one's politics as the whole of one's identity is bad for a country, bad for a person. But the sort of world that defines one's gospel by such things is infinitely worse. If Jesus is right about the gospel, and I think he is, Jimmy Carter's in heaven. And so are a lot of other people, a number no man can number, who were wrong on some or another serious political or moral or social questions. As a matter of fact, I think the description will include every human being there, except for the one actually sitting on the judgment seat. This is Russell Moore. You're listening to the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter here on The Russell Moore Show.